In a Narrow Grave, Essays on Texas by Larry McMurtry. This book consists of 173 pages, arranged in 9 essays, a preface, and an introduction. By my father's grave there let mine be, and bury me not on the lone prairie. Oh, bury me not. And his voice failed there, but we took no heed of his dying prayer. In a narrow grave just 6 by 3, we buried him there on the lone prairie. The Dying Cowboy. For James, and to the memory of Uncle Jeff and Uncle Johnny, and for Ken Casey, the last wagon master. We beat the drums slowly, and shook the spurs lowly, and bitterly wept as we bore him along, for we all loved our comrade, so brave, young, and handsome. We all loved the cowboy, although he'd done wrong. The Cowboy's Lament. I first took to drinking and then to card playing, and they'd all be drunk when they was singing it, most likely. Cowboys loved to sing about people dying. I don't know why. I guess it was because they was so full of life themselves. Teddy Blue, we pointed them north. A Preface. In his introduction to Cannibals and Christians, Mr. Norman Mailer draws a succinct and provocative distinction between 2 sorts of writers who publish essay collections. The first kind writes sufficiently well to induce his publishers to put together his very separate pieces, and they are printed as a convenience to his readers. In such collections there is a tendency for the attitude to belong to the subject more than to the author. Professional football is seen as professional football, and ladies' fashion as ladies' fashion. The other kind of writer may be better or worse, but the writings always have a touch of the grandiose, even the megalomaniacal. The reason may be that the writings are parts of a continuing and more or less comprehensive vision of existence into which everything must fit. Of course, if the vision is interesting, the fit can be startling, dramatic, illuminating. But good or poor, the unspoken urge is to find secret relations between professional football and ladies' fashion, and bring them in alive as partners to the vision. Mr. Mailer, brilliant and durable provocateur that he is, naturally wants his own collections in the second category, and he devised, as long ago as 1959, a method of commentary, partly autobiographical, partly metaphoric, which functions as a sort of highly tensile intellectual bailing wire, very useful to him when he wants to bring a cutting of essays out of the field and put them, as it were, in the literary barn. His method is well worth pondering, particularly if one is, as I am, a young writer about to publish a book of essays, all of which deal with a subject of less interest to literate Americans than either professional football or ladies' fashion, to wit, Texas. Unfortunately, the essays I have published are so few and so local that no amount of commentary could bind them into an interesting bale. I should perhaps have left them to rot in the fields, but instead I have chosen to subsume them into a longer and, I hope, a larger work. For a time I thought it might be possible to stitch the individual pieces into a single lengthy essay, a seamless, well-cut aesthetic garment. Indeed, it might have been possible, but if so, I was not a good enough tailor. The garment that resulted is ragged and anything but seamless, and in a number of places the skin of my original subject has been left quite bare. Nevertheless, though what follows is not a single essay, it is, I believe, continuous. My vision of existence is based almost entirely upon a prolonged scrutiny of West Texas, and is probably too dry and flat, and I have no wish to be either grandiose or megalomaniacal. What I do claim is that the attitude in the following pages belongs to me, not to my subject. An interviewer once asked Mr. John Barth if it were true that there came a time in the creation of a novel when the characters suddenly rose up and took command of a narrative. Mr. Barth said no, but it was clear that the mere prospect of such a literary mutiny left him somewhat shaken. "Those rascals aren't going to get control if I can help it," he added staunchly. "I feel much the same way about my subject here. I haven't spent 30 years in Texas just to be able to be objective about the place." In the same interview, Mr. Barth goes on to speculate that perhaps the novelist's basic motive is a desire to reinvent the world. A noble motive, surely, and never more so than now. Perhaps such a motive is no less noble when applied to smaller geographical units. If someone in the 20s had had a competent go at reinventing Texas, what might we be today? In any case, I agree with Mr. Barth that the novel is a superb medium for such a reinvention, very probably the best medium that we have. For myself, the novel is a habitation. The essay is neither so familiar nor so constant. The essay is a place one visits occasionally when one is tired of home. It offers the comforts of a fine hotel. One can stroll about in one's best clothes and ruminate upon all those things one never has time to ruminate upon at home, and what I generally find I am ruminating upon in the essay is home itself, the place where my characters live. I can never be quite sure whether home is a place or a form, the novel or Texas. In daily life, the two become crucially but vaguely related, and it is difficult to say with precision where place stops supporting fiction and fiction starts embodying place. One of the purposes of these essays is to investigate that relation, if only indirectly. I have a feeling I had better decide where I'm living before I do any more remodeling or reinventing. If I could summon 2 writers from the shades and set them the task of writing about this state, I think I would summon D.H. Lawrence and Machado de Assis. I would want Lawrence as he was in the early 20s, at about the time of England, My England, or the Studies in Classic American Literature. Machado I would prefer in middle age, perhaps around 1880, when he was fed up with romantic convention and ready to write the epitaph of a small winner. With Lawrence at his keenest and Machado at his driest and most deft, Texas would be had. Of course, if left around too long, they both might end up liking the place. Lawrence was susceptible to the primitive, Machado to the feudal, and a great many visiting sharpshooters do end up liking Texas. One sees them here and there about the state, settled comfortably amid their chipped and shattered targets. At any rate, it is not always the aim one admires in Lawrence and Machado. It is the assurance with which they shoot. It is their authority, the clarity of their observations, and their quickness. Here one paragraph, there the next. Such agility is enviable, and particularly so if one is setting out to write about Texas. Faced with such a task, one would like to be quick, clear, and agile. Let a thought or a memory get a few yards head start, and one might have to chase it halfway across the state. It is like roping in the brush country. If you don't catch the calf in the first clearing, you may be in for a long and thorny pursuit. In what follows, I have been as succinct as possible, hoping to spare the reader thorns. At times I have been more than succinct. Peremptory would be the accurate word. Much of the book is opinion, my opinion, and for the most part I have chosen simply to lay it out, garnished with a sliver of memory or the salt of metaphor. Pussyfooting is a vice I have been concerned to avoid. It has come to my notice, however, that in these parts directness is frequently taken for malice. With that in mind, I might say at the outset that in criticizing Texas, I have not been unaware that there are other states to which the same criticisms might apply. If so, that's dandy. I am sure there are potatoes in Nebraska, but Nebraska is not my rooting ground. An Introduction. The God Abandons Texas. Being a writer and a Texan is an amusing fate, one that gets funnier as one's sense of humor darkens. In times like these, it verges on the macabre. Apparently, there was a time in the 40s and 50s when people sort of enjoyed reading about Texas. If the reading was light enough, the state was thought to be different, another country almost. It had Neiman Marcus and the Alamo and a lot of rather endearing millionaires. As late as 1961, Mr. John Bainbridge of the New Yorker was able to do well with a book called The Super Americans, a collection of polite anecdotes about the millionaires. For Texas letters, the 40s and 50s were the golden age. That is, J. Frank Dobie was still alive. To Texas readers, he was a notch above Homer and a notch below Shakespeare, while the world outside reckoned him almost as good as Carl Sandburg. One moderately good writer was all that was expected of a place like Texas. In those days, of course, Lyndon Johnson was still only half of Rayburn and Johnson. The nation's intellectuals lost no sleep over him, and McBird was undreamt of. Alas, all is changed. We aren't thought of as quaintly vulgar anymore. Some may find us dangerously vulgar, but the majority just find us boring. As a subject, Texas has become frankly stultifying. If it is another country, it is a country literate America hopes to hear no more about. That magisterial stream, the Pedernales, is frequently pissed in now by intellectuals who appear to hope that the products of their literary bladders will somehow eat holes in the presidential motorboat. Having yielded Mr. Johnson, it is hardly to be expected that the state will yield anything funny in the next few years, much less anything aesthetically interesting. Thus, the writer, like myself, whose characters live in Texas, may find himself writing into a rather stiff wind. If he is ambivalent about the state as a place, the stiffness of the wind may cause him to become discouraged about it as a subject. This is particularly apt to happen if he attempts to write from Texas as well as about it. Many Texas writers migrate, of course, and make their way to the literary capitals. There they often find their frontier manners and their experience in the boondocks so marketable socially that they have little time for reflection and, indeed, little desire to reflect upon the place they have left. What most of them find the time for is nostalgia, a somewhat different thing. It would be a pity if the chill literary winds discouraged too many people about Texas as a subject, for present-day Texas is a very rich subject, particularly for the novelist. Present-day California might be even richer, but California, whether as a subject or a place to live, is almost too taxing. There the confusion is greater, the rivalries of manners more intense. The question is whether anyone can live in California and comprehend it clearly now. Nathaniel West would have a harder time with the state today than he had in 1939. Texas is almost as intense, but much less dizzying. Society here is divided, but it is not yet fragmented to a degree that would raise difficulties for the novelist. The state is at that stage of metamorphosis when it is most fertile with conflict, when rural and soil traditions are competing most desperately with urban traditions, competing for the allegiance of the young. The city will win, of course, but its victory won't be cheap. The country traditions were very strong. As the cowboys gradually leave the range and learn to accommodate themselves to the suburbs, defeats that are tragic in quality must occur and may be recorded. I started, indeed, to call this book The Cowboy in the Suburb, but chose the present title instead, because I wanted a tone that was elegiac rather than sociological. Nonetheless, I think it is essentially that movement from country to subdivision, home place to metropolis, that gives life in present-day Texas its passion, or if not its passion, its strong, peculiar mixture of passions, part spurious and part genuine, part ridiculous and part tragic. However boring Texas might be to move to, it is not a boring place to be rooted. The transition that is taking place is very difficult, and the situations it creates are very intense. Living here consciously uses a great deal of one's blood. It involves one at once in a birth, a death, and a bitter love affair. From the birth I expect very little. The new Texas is probably going to be a sort of kid brother to California, with a kid brother's tendency to imitation. The death, however, moves me. The way of life that is dying had its value. Its appeal was simple but genuine, and it called to it and is taking with it people whom one could not but love. The last, the affair of the heart and blood, is really more physical than would have seemed possible with a land so unadorned, but the quality of one's intimacy with a place seems to depend as little on adornment as the quality of one's intimacy with a woman. One should not perhaps call it a bitter love affair, merely one that has become a little too raw, too real, too stripped of fantasy. The time may have come to part or marry, but for myself I put no trust in either alternative. Parting would not leave me free, nor marriage make me happy. There is a song Texas kids still sing, a song about the passing of the cowboy. I'm going to leave old Texas now. They've got no use for the longhorn cow. They've plowed and fenced my cattle range, and the people there are all so strange. It is a slight song, but for the Texas writer an inescapable subject. When I think about the passing of the cowboy, my mind inappropriately hangs on the poem of Cavafis from the scene in Shakespeare, from the sentence of Plutarch's, the poem in which the god abandons Antony. I like Cavafis' treatment best, with Antony at his window at night in Alexandria, bidden to drink past all deceiving, while the god and his retinue file away. In Shakespeare, only the guards hear the strange music that marks the god's departure, but it is still a telling moment, indeed a telling fancy. I can believe I have heard such music myself in Fort Worth, Houston, Dallas, by the Rio Grande and the Brazos, in the brush country and on the staked plains. The music of departure is now rather faint, the god almost out of hearing. The god who abandoned Antony was Hercules. What is the name of the god who now abandons Texas? Sometimes I see him as Old Man Goodnight, or as Teddy Blue, or as my Uncle Johnny. All people the reader will meet if the reader reads on. But the one thing that is sure is that he was a horseman and a god of the country. His home was the frontier, and his mythos celebrates those masculine ideals appropriate to a frontier. Myself, I dislike frontiers, and yet the sense that my own has vanished produces in me the strongest emotion I have felt in connection with Texas, or with any place. It has embedded itself in the titles of each of my books, and just as I think I have worn the emotion out, it seizes me again, usually at some unlikely moment. I see my son, age 5, riding a mechanical horse in front of the laundromat on Sunday morning, and the sight calls up my Uncle Johnny, when he was age 5, sitting on top of the McMurtry barn, watching the last trail herd go by. It is indeed a complex distance from those trail drivers who made my father and my uncles determined to be cowboys, to the mechanical horse that helps convince my son that he is a cowboy as he takes a vertical ride in front of a laundromat. That is the distance I hope to cover in this book. It may, like my other books, be a form of parting, a wave of the hand at Old Man Goodnight, Teddy Blue, Uncle Johnny, and all they stood for. It is also, on a baser level, a literary gambit. It has clearly become necessary to write discursively of Texas if one is to be heard at all beyond one's city limits. The South, fortunately for its writer, has always been dark and bloody ground, but Texas is only scenery, and poor scenery at that. Even so, Mr. Faulkner had to write about a girl being raped with a corn cob before he gained more than a semblance of a readership, and most of that soon deserted him. Today the fields of fiction are littered with raped bodies. Try the corn-crib route, and readers will yawn in your face. As a regionalist, and a regionalist from an unpopular region, I find the problem of how to get heard rather a fascinating one. I haven't found it especially depressing, but then I wouldn't have gone in for writing if I hadn't liked talking to myself. I quite recognize that there have always been literary capitals and literary provinces, and that those who choose for whatever reason to abide in the provinces need not expect a modish recognition. Recently, of course, the picture has become much brighter. The Texas writer who really wants to get famous has only to work up his autobiography in such a way that it will, 1, explain the assassination, and 2, make it possible for President Johnson to be impeached. If he can do that, his name is made. The New York Review of Books will beat a path to his door, particularly if his door happens to be somewhere in Manhattan. Should his door be in Anarene, Texas, they will probably rely on the mails, but in any event he can put obscurity behind him. If he ever gets to New York, he may even meet Susan Sontag. I don't understand the assassination, and I doubt that I can do anything about the president. My chances of meeting Miss Sontag are accordingly pretty slim. and I had as well forget about it and go on and write a book about the place where my characters live. I have a feeling I had better do it now, before the emotion I feel at the thought of the God becomes only the memory of an emotion. That God is riding fast away, and will soon be out of sight and out of hearing. In a narrow grave. I should like to start this book with Hud and end it with my family, the McMurtrys. That may entail a passage from the unreal to the real, or it may entail the reverse. We shall see. Here's Hud in your eye. 1. In 1961, I published a first novel called Horsemen Pass By, a title I felt sure the world would remember. To my surprise, the world quietly overlooked it, and even the few staunch friends who read the book seemed to experience the gravest difficulties with the title. Some called it Horsemen Goodbye, others Horsemen Ride By, still others Passing the Horseman. One colleague took to calling it So Long, Horseman, but since he customarily speaks of my second book, Leaving Cheyenne, as leaving El Paso, I have decided that perhaps his memory is unusually whimsical. The nadir was reached one day when a kind but dotty old lady asked me if I was the man who wrote The Four Horsemen of the Alamo. One evening, several months after the novel was published, I was sitting in Fort Worth, eating my Sunday supper, when the phone rang, and an excited Hollywood voice informed me that Paramount Studios was about to film my book. The title, of course, would have to be changed. It was much too poetic. Could I suggest an alternate? Offhand, I couldn't, but I cheerfully agreed to try. I had begun to feel that my devoted readership deserved something simpler in the way of titles. A few weeks later, Mr. Lloyd Anderson, the genial Paramount location manager, came to Texas to look for a film site. One evening, over dinner, I asked him if they had decided what the picture would be called. "Well, not definitely," he said, poking his steak with sudden embarrassment. "They're thinking of calling it Wild Desire." After a moment of silence, we went gamely on with our meal. "Write them if you've got any suggestions," Mr. Anderson said. "Don't hesitate. They'd be glad to get your ideas." I mulled the matter over for a few days and then sent Paramount a list of about a dozen titles. The best, as I recall, was Coitus on Horseback, a title I had long hoped to fit onto something. I mulled the matter over for a few days and then sent Paramount a list of about a dozen titles. The best, as I recall, was Coitus on Horseback, a title I had long hoped to fit onto something. In the rush of production, that and the rest of my suggestions somehow got brushed aside. The next report I had, Paramount was going to call it Hud Bannon Against the World. At that point, I decided to give up on titles and concentrate my hopes on the location committee. If they weren't going to call it Coitus on Horseback, I hoped they might at least find it possible to make the film in Archer County, where I was raised. Archer County is not particularly scenic, but I was all primed to observe the impact of Hollywood on my hometown. Black humor was just being invented, and I could think of no easier way to get in on it. Mr. Anderson obligingly took pictures of Archer County, all one northery winter day, but all he got for his trouble was frozen hands and shots of several thousand denuded and uncinematic mesquites. Archer County clearly would not do. In late March 1962, Mr. Anderson informed me that a location had been chosen near the town of Claude in the Texas Panhandle. Claude, population 895, lies 30 miles southeast of Amarillo, a city I have always regarded as Ultima Thule. Most of the filming was to be done around an old abandoned ranch house a mile or so from Claude, but the pasture scenes would be filmed near the hamlet of Goodnight in the rugged country bordering the Palo Duro Canyon. When I saw the locations, I had to admit that Archer County had been fairly defeated. In addition to the topographic advantages, there was a certain fitness in having a film which was in some sense about the end of ranching, filmed so near the place where Old Man Goodnight had established the first Panhandle Ranch. Goodnight drove the first herd into the Palo Duro in 1876 and built the great J.A., the cattle ranch, whose present headquarters are only a few miles from where Hud was filmed. No doubt the old man, as he is still called in that country, would have been disgusted by Hud if he could have seen it. But then, if he were ranching today, he would scarcely need to go to the movies to find things to disgust him. Certainly, he left the mark of his personality on the Panhandle as no other man ever has or likely ever will. The local cowboys who worked around the movie set knew a great deal more about Charles Goodnight than they knew about Paul Newman or any other movie star. Often, during lulls in the filming, as I watched the white June thunderheads roll southward over the plains, I thought of the old man, a vigorous, irascible, lonely figure. In that country, looking at the weathered ranch buildings or out across the grassy, shadow-flecked plains, it was easier to believe in the ghost of Old Man Goodnight than in the costume department darling in huaraches and yellow silk shirt who crossed and recrossed one's path. Because of teaching duties in Fort Worth, I missed the first month of filming. I made the drive to Amarillo one evening in early June, a cool, windy evening with distant lightning and the rumble of spring thunder on the plains. Just before midnight, I passed through Claude, its streets deserted, its houses dark. I didn't even slow down. There was only a yellow blinker light where the highway cuts across the main street, but I noticed as I passed through that the name on the water tower had been changed. It read Thalia, the name of the imaginary town in my novels. It was one of the finer moments I've had as an author. The cast and production crew were staying at the huge Ramada Inn in Amarillo. It was midnight or after when I drove up, but a stream of traffic was circling the motel like Indians supposedly circled wagon trains. I broke through only with difficulty and checked in. 2 policemen were standing by the swimming pool, morosely watching the traffic. "If it was teenagers, I could see it," one said, "but it ain't. It's grown women, too, hoping Paul Newman will come out and dive off this here diving board. Something like this comes to town, you find out just how crazy the public is." It appeared that the 2 officers were supposed to keep the town women from swarming over the motel and breaking into the actors' bedrooms, a task they found spiritually wearying. "I'd rather be out chousing Mexicans," one officer said. "You can't stop all these women. Funny thing is, I grew up in this town, and I don't remember there being so many women around. I wouldn't have thought there was this many women in the whole Panhandle." The other officer seconded that. Only the week before, for all their vigilance, a bulky matron had managed to get through Newman's window in the early morning, and after that he and Brandon DeWilde had shifted rooms every 2 or 3 days to confuse enemy intelligence, as it were. "Never seen anything like it," one officer said. I hadn't either, so we all 3 stood at the edge of the pool and watched the circling ladies for a while. Diversion is not to be sneezed at in Amarillo. Paramount had rented a small flotilla of cars to transport the crew to and from the set, and the next morning one was made available to me. A publicity man offered to be my guide. When we started out, he was very cheerful, but on the way the sky began to cloud over, and the man's mood darkened accordingly. Rain meant lost time, and time was selling for $30,000 a day. We turned off the highway just south of Goodnight, and were immediately stopped by a man with a walkie-talkie. The road was in camera, and since they were shooting, we would have to wait. The wait lasted an hour. We listened hopefully to the hum of the walkie-talkie, and watched the thickening gray clouds spume toward us out of the northwest. Just as I thought we were about to be allowed in, the guard hurried over and hastily motioned us off the road. The movie people were coming out. A huge truck with a camera boom on it came first, followed closely by about 30 cars in tight formation. The dust they raised on the dry road was sufficient to obscure whatever celebrities may have been inside. We followed, and happily managed to park before the interceptors with the walkie-talkies got set up. As luck would have it, we parked only a few yards from the car containing Paul Newman and Brandon DeWilde. They had just finished a roundup scene, and were dressed like working cowboys, brown chaps, spurs, dusty boots, Levi jackets, and well-broken-in straw hats. Their dress was perfectly authentic, indistinguishable from that of the dozen or so real cowboys who worked as extras in the cattle scenes, but even so they didn't particularly look like cowboys. DeWilde looked like someone a millionaire oil man might invite to his ranch for a weekend. He was enjoying the fantasy that he was a real cowboy, a man of the soil, but he walked like a young executive, and showed no hint of the characteristic slouch most cowboys adopt when they are afoot. On a horse he was even worse, as the film abundantly documents. Newman came a great deal closer. He had picked up the cowboy's habit of cocking one hip higher than the other when he was standing still, and one could almost have taken him for a young, aggressive rancher, someone just beginning to make his pile. One could have, perhaps, had it not been for his eyes. His look was introspected and self-occupied, though not egotistical. He simply looked more curious about himself than most young ranchers look. In the next hour I met a great many movie people, but the only one from that hour that I remember well were Martin Ritt, the director, and Harriet and Irving Ravitch, the screenwriters. I am not sure how I expected to be greeted, but I was certainly ill-prepared for the barrage of apologies I faced. For the first 2 hours no one did anything but apologize to me, presumably because they had wrought changes in my book. I had quite expected the changes and didn't care at all. By that time I didn't think much of the novel anyway. I told them as much, but no one seemed to believe me, and my mild assurances of goodwill merely served to increase the general uneasiness at having an author on the set. I think they would have welcomed some display of temper. As it was, my quiet confusion was taken for Olympian disdain. Fortunately, lunch soon came, and everyone loosened up a bit. The Ravitches and I made our way to the end of the chow line, and were soon joined by Newman, who had a copy of a Dürrenmatt play in his hand. Harriet Ravitch was attempting to protect herself from the wind and the abrasive dust with a formidable hat and a curtain of scarves. She succeeded rather well, but others were suffering considerably. Most of the crew had adopted the dress of the region. Only the art director could have been considered sartorially eccentric. He wore high-topped safari boots, heavy duck clothing, and an Australian bush hat. Lunch was served each day by the late Walter Jetton of Fort Worth, who was soon to become barbecuer to the President. Whatever one may think about Mr. Jetton's barbecue, his organization had to be admired. The 110-man crew, plus guests, were stuffed with professional dispatch. The fare was a sort of family reunion special: pinto beans with chili pepper, potato salad, beef, chicken, ribs, ham, coleslaw, stewed apricots, cobbler, iced tea, and coffee. Tables were ranged along the long porch of the old ranch house, and people ate there or on the ground. Those so fastidious as not to like panhandle sand in their iced tea ate inside the house, which was completely bare except for a table piled with photographs. I have no fondness for sand and chose to eat inside. There was no place to sit, so I stood up and idly looked through the stills as I ate. I noticed there seemed to be an awful lot of photographs of buzzards, and when I went outside to get some more beans, I asked the Ravitches how the buzzard scene had turned out. I had merely thought to make conversation, and was a little taken aback by the number of stricken looks that turned my way. "Oh, those fucking buzzards," someone said, in a tone that discouraged further discussion. Later, I managed to get a version of the buzzard story from some extras who thought it hilarious. There was to be a scene in which a number of buzzards sit around waiting for the people to leave so they can consume a dead heifer. Newman roars up and in his wild way shoots one of the buzzards, whereupon the others fly away. The first difficulty turned out to be getting the buzzards. There are no professional buzzard trappers in the Panhandle, and the few birds that showed up of their own accord were skittery and unphotogenic. It was necessary to arrange for someone in the vicinity of Laredo, roughly 1,000 miles away, to round up a dozen buzzards and fly them by jet to Amarillo. The plan was to wire the buzzards to a dead tree until they had been photographed. Then, when Newman shot the gun, they could be released electronically and photographed again as they soared into the blue Panhandle sky. In outline, it was a good plan, but it quite failed to take into account the mentality of buzzards. As soon as they were wired to the tree, they all began to try and fly away. The wires prevented that, of course, but did not prevent them from falling off the limbs, where they dangled upside down, wings flapping, nether parts exposed. It is hard to imagine anything less likely to beguile a movie-going audience than a tree full of dangling buzzards. Everyone agreed it was unaesthetic. The buzzards were righted, but they tried again, and with each try their humiliation deepened. Finally, they abandoned their efforts to fly away and resigned themselves to life on their tree. Their resignation was so complete that when the scene was readied and the time came for them to fly, they refused. They had had enough of ignominy. Better to remain on the limb indefinitely. Buzzards are not without patience. Profanity, firecrackers, even a shotgun full of rock salt failed to move them. I'm told that in desperation a birdman was flown in from L.A. to teach the sulky bastards how to fly. The whole experience left everyone touchy. A day or so later, looking at the pictures again, I noticed a further provocative detail. The dead heifer that figured so prominently in the scene was quite clearly a steer. When I pointed this out to the still photographers, they just shrugged. A steer was close enough. After all, they were both essentially cows. In essence, it's a cow, one said moodily. No one wanted those buzzards back again. As it happened, I was not the only McMurtry connected with HUD. The cattle used in the film belonged to my cousin Alfred, whose ranch adjoined the land where the film was made. During the many lulls in shooting, I visited with Alfred and his cowhands, hoping to find out how the cowboys reacted to the whole thing. It is not every day that cowboys get the chance to assist in creating an illusion about themselves. When I first arrived, the cowhands were all looking forward to a scene in which Brandon DeWilde was to be kicked into a fence by a cow. DeWilde's stand-in was the one who would actually be kicked, a local boy whom all the cowboys knew. He was not exactly unpopular, but it was clear that the men thought stardom had gone to his head a bit. Getting kicked through a fence 10 or 15 times would probably do him good. On the whole, the cowhands derived a great deal of amusement from the film making. They got on famously with the production crew, most of whom were as down-to-earth as they were. The hierarchy, stars, director, screenwriters, they regarded with tolerant incredulity. They clearly felt that what was going on was beyond the reach of ordinary human comprehension, and were consequently as diffident as they would have been with a company of Martians. "I'm just working from the shoulders down," one said, summing it up for them all. On the third day of my visit, a scene was prepared in which the cattle were put through the chutes and vaccinated. To hold them for inspection, the movie makers were proposing to use a device called a dehorning gate, a heavy gate with a number of levers and bars which lock an animal's head firmly in place. A dehorning gate is painful enough for cattle, but it is deadlier far to the man who operates it unless the man is an expert. He must catch the thrashing animal at just the right moment as it emerges from the chute. If his timing is off and the animal kicks just right, the operator may catch one or both levers in the face. Even experienced gatemen miss every now and then, and a broken jaw is one of the milder results. The movie makers, unaware of this danger, were planning to have Paul Newman operate the levers himself. DeWilde could much more safely have been kicked through the fence a few times. The cowboys all knew this, but none of them made a move to mention it to the director. I mentioned it to him, and when I asked the cowboys why they hadn't, they just shrugged. Ritt was the director. For all they knew, he wanted Newman to get hit in the jaw. Like most visitors to a film set, I soon discovered that my curiosity about filming was more limited than I would have supposed. It seemed a slow, repetitious, tedious business, no more so to me than to the people engaged in it. Except for Martin Ritt and James Wong Howe, almost everyone connected with the movie seemed bored. Half the crew was always inactive, and this half spent its time in one of the equipment sheds, gossiping, drinking coffee, gawking and being gawked at, and talking about sex. Ritt and Howe were the only two whose attention was fully and continuously engaged by the filming. The rest killed what time there was to kill as best they could. Newman did it most sensibly by staying in his dressing room and reading. Others did it by titillating the crowd of local visitors. DeWilde practiced riding. Melvyn Douglas reminisced about the stage. The fellow who got the biggest kick out of dazzling the locals was a sort of Westian cowboy, a lineal descendant of Earl Shoup in the day of the locust. His mannerisms were updated, and his idiom was closer to Stony Burke than William S. Hart, but he was still very clearly a marginal man, a creature of the fringe. His nickname was S.C. for Supercock, and his stock in trade was sex. He talked, thought, knew nothing else. He had an official position, but I never saw him exercise it. Had it not been for his ability to keep the idle members of the crew amused, he would have been dead weight. Whether his nickname flattered him, I cannot attest, but I did observe that he had a way with women. He might not have been able to take them in, but he could certainly draw them out. Several times I saw him introduce himself to a group of farm women, none of whom had probably uttered 10 words about sex in their entire lives. His candor seemed to hypnotize them. Doubtless in their experience it was unprecedented. Within 20 minutes he would have them talking about their orgasms, those of them at least who had had any to talk about. Many were put on the defensive and found themselves attempting to defend their husbands' performances, an awkward and unaccustomed task. Whatever the defense, S.C. always managed to be pleasantly derisive, pointing out to this or that little lady that she probably lacked a valid standard of comparison. Later, in Hollywood, I saw S.C. lurking outside the studio in a 4-year-old car, waiting to try his luck with the secretaries when they emerged at 5 o'clock. He looked much diminished. To the little ladies of Los Angeles, he was just another cowboy shirt. In Texas, as a general rule, money comes into the conversation much oftener than sex. On the movie set, the reverse prevailed. Millions were being spent, but were seldom mentioned. Sex got mentioned constantly. The tedium of location work had to be relieved some way. At one point we were out on the plains shooting a scene with 2 longhorns when a heavy rain shower hit. Everyone piled into cars to wait for it to pass over, and I landed in a car with Martin Ritt and several of the actors. Someone mentioned a Richard Burton doll, the latest thing in Hollywood toys. You wound it up and it did incredible things to Elizabeth Taylor. This reminded someone of something that lady was rumored to have done during the filming of Giant, which in turn reminded someone else of a disease Marlon Brando was rumored to have caught in Tahiti while doing Mutiny on the Bounty. Things went on in this vein for several minutes, and I suddenly noticed that the back of the driver's neck had grown very red. I don't know what spades are called in California, but I have noted that the copulative act is usually called fucking, mixed company or no. We were mixed company, and the driver, a local man, was most probably a deacon in the Baptist church. None of the movie people even noticed that he had turned red. On this particular day, Brandon DeWilde was feeling gloomy. It was clear that he was struggling hard to leave adolescence behind, but it wasn't always clear whether he was winning or losing. The most distasteful part of movie making, he complained, was that strange women kept trying to crawl in bed with him. He was an engaged man, and he had scruples. Some locations were worse than others. During the filming of All Fall Down, his scruples had been overcome some 18 times. A nightmare. A colleague unkindly pointed out that his scruples were of about the consistency of toilet paper, but I don't think DeWilde heard him. He was trying to decide whether to fly to El Paso that weekend to test his scruples against the flesh pots of Juarez. I was only around the set a few days, but that was quite long enough. the presence of the Californians set the life of the Panhandle in an odd perspective, one that I won't soon forget. I remember the stringy, hard-handed farm women giggling at SC's indecencies, the solid, silent driver turning red, the wives and daughters of Amarillo circling the Ramada Inn at night. In retrospect, the reactions seem perfectly predictable. The men of the area felt directly threatened. Here was an energy and a masculinity that seemed stronger than their own. Women, on the other hand, felt expectant. Hollywood, with all its money and its possibility, was finally there. Anything might happen. Their leaden lives might be made golden somehow. When the movie was released, West Texas reacted ambivalently, but along much these same lines. It was said to be profane, and members of the hard-shell sects stayed away. A lady of my acquaintance offered to stay home and pray for her family while they went. Despite its taint, a great many people did go see it, and most of them came away enthusiastic. It was generally regarded as an accurate, even flattering picture of the area. The Panhandle preened itself for a time, and a baby or two was named Hud. Any number of people assured me they knew someone just like Hud. Their Hud was a real hellion, they told me. If they were men, their tone indicated that he was the sort of man they almost wished they had been. Tough, capable, wild, undomesticated. Invariably, they would hasten to add that, so far as acting went, Melvyn Douglas took the cake. Hud might tempt them, but they knew well enough that old Homer was the sort of man their fathers had wanted them to be. Hud had made terms with the 20th century, whereas Homer was unwaveringly faithful to the 19th. And in those parts, the 19th century ideal has not yet lost its force. That Homer was a dreadfully sentimentalized version of the 19th century cattleman was apparently never noticed, except by Pauline Kael. Her excellent essay provides all that is needed in the way of criticism of Hud. If the men of the area wavered and were ultimately unable to identify either with Homer or with Hud, the women had no such problem. Most of them probably identified with the unseen woman whose bed Hud leaves when the movie opens. You don't find many Texas women willing to identify with a ranch cook, not even one that looks like Patricia Neal. Women seldom mentioned Miss Neal to me until after her illness, when tragedy had placed her clearly in a domestic context. To date, I have seen Hud 6 times, twice on my own and 4 times due to circumstances beyond my control. One showing was a bit unusual. It was to a college film group, and the young projectionist had neglected to bring his cinemascope adjuster. Since the screen was only 12 feet wide, the distortions that resulted were bizarre. The verticals were elongated, the horizontals squashed. Hud's Cadillac became a fat Volkswagen. The beautiful proportions were lost, and one was left with nothing but the drama. The 6th time around, I decided I couldn't bear to watch it again, so I sat outside and listened. Again I was left with the drama.